Hey everyone, Azo here and welcome to another opening crash course, this time on the French defense, a solid yet dynamic answer to 1 e4 for black, that is e6. Now why did I choose the French defense? Because compared to other openings, the French does not require excessive memory work. Instead, you simply need to understand the key ideas behind the common positions that will arise. So that will be the start of this video, exploring concepts rather than simply regurgitating theoretical lines. In this way, you get some flexibility on which sub-variations to play. So without further ado, let's begin. We have e4 and then e6, and after white grabs the center with d4, which is how nearly all games proceed, we strike back with d5, attacking e4, and white is forced to deal with it. There are several options, but the most important one to understand is e5. Not because this is white's most trying response necessarily, but because in many other variations, even if your opponent does not go e5 right away, you are likely to see this same pawn structure. I'll drop a few examples. If say white went knight d2 to maintain the tension on e4, we can go knight f6 to add an attacker, and again virtually all games continue with e5 on this fourth move, and we get back the same pawn structure. Or if white went knight c3 here, we can do the same thing, knight f6, but the difference here is that white isn't obliged to push e5, because knight c3 keeps this dark square bishop free, so he can also pin our attacker to the queen, but we can simply unpin it with bishop e7, and the threat on e4 is renewed, forcing e5 once again. Also, after knight c3, the bishop may remain liberated, but the downside is that compared to knight d2, black has the additional option of bishop b4 to pin the defender and indirectly attack e4, forcing e5 once again. So hopefully by now, you're convinced of the importance of this pawn structure when learning the French, so let's analyze it. It might appear that white is superior because of the far advanced e-pawn. However, it isn't that clear-cut. These far extended pawns can actually be targets for us, for black. And so the battle here is between whether these white pawns are an asset or a liability to white. And the best way to tear down this pawn duo is with the first key idea, the c5 pawn break, attacking the base of the pawn chain. If white allows this pawn trade to happen, the whole center falls apart. Now you might be thinking that white is doing perfectly fine because he can easily reinforce the center with c3 and then f4 and maintain a seemingly impressive center. The problem is that it takes too much time. And what do we do with that time specifically? We start attacking d4 with queen to b6, and now we can see an added bonus is that we have some pressure on b2, which means that the dark square bishop can't help out with the defense on d4 so easily. White has to defend with knight f3, and then we add more attackers with knight h6, and suddenly there's no stopping knight f5. Knight e7 would not be nearly as good, because it allows white to bail out nicely with d takes c5, and instead of elegantly developing and recapturing with our bishop, we are forced to move our queen a second time. In any case, after knight h6, if white wants to preserve his material, he has to concede his center and allow black this huge lead in development. By the way, quick quiz here. What would you do if white plays knight to a3? Pause the video to try this. Alright, because white is planning knight c2 to overprotect d4, the easiest is to trade on d4, then take on a3, and go knight f5 to win the pawn. I also would like to emphasize the importance of a single tempo in this position. Had white not spent that unnecessary move on f4, he would have had the extra tempo to adequately deal with the onslaught on d4. One simple example, if white had this hypothetical extra tempo right after playing f4, he can go bishop e3 to protect d4, and then defend b2 with queen d2, and he has untangled this mess. However, as is, white does not have that extra tempo. So going back, it is clear white can't just have his cake and eat it with moves like f4. He must focus on development. So let's look at knight f3 instead. Now we're not just going to go for the same plan, Not just because of white's extra tempo having not played f4, but also because after knight h6, there's bishop takes h6. So instead, I recommend going bishop to d7. Now why bishop to d7? This is a move you know you're going to make eventually, because at some point, if say you develop another piece, you've got to move the bishop out anyway, and as far as we can see, only d7 is tenable. Now what about the other main move, queen to b6? It attacks d4, but the queen isn't always best placed on b6. Sometimes, it is better placed on c7 to attack e5, which can be a target after yet another key pawn break, f6. Now this f6 pawn break is more risky compared to c5, because we will have a backward e6 pawn and a weakened h5 to e8 diagonal. But if executed well, it can yield very good results. So what's an example of good execution? I'll return to the bishop d7 line and show one variation, a3. Now I didn't just pull this move out of nowhere. According to the game database, this is a pretty popular line at the master level, only second to bishop e2. The idea is to expand on the queen side with b4. Now let's analyze some of the key features in this line thus far. White has failed to develop a piece with his last move. Our queen position remains flexible, and white did not play f4 to reinforce e5. So all of this confirms that now is the time to go f6, hitting e5. So we are punishing white for neglecting his development by opening up the center. Now white wouldn't want to just throw away his center with e takes f6, where we can develop a great kingside attack very easily. So let's consider other options. Let's say white continues with b4, consistent with a3. We can take on e5, and after pawn takes, or even knight takes, the target will no longer be on d4, but on e5, which means our queen belongs on c7, and queen b6 will be completely senseless. And that's why we delay the development of pieces like our queen with waiting moves like bishop d7. We want to wait for the position to develop a little, and only after the target is clarified can we commit our queen to the correct square. Now I'd also like to show another instructive line here. After f takes e5, what will you do if white did not take back, but went b5 to attack the knight as a Zwischenzug? Pause the video if you'd like to find the move yourself. The move here is knight takes d4, sacrificing a piece for 3 pawns. And at the end of the day, material is equal, and black has a colossal center. And that just goes to show the power of the 2 pawn breaks c5 and f6 we got from this position on move 3, where we had slightly less space, to this. So that was about a3. Now I want to show another common line at the amateur level, bishop d3. This is a variation not often played at the master level. Now why is that? It's because it interferes with the queen's defense to the d4 pawn. So what's the move here? You can pause the video if you need more time. It's c takes d4, followed by queen b6. And again, you can see the flexibility behind delaying the queen's development. Only now that d4 is a little weaker, can you confidently commit your queen to b6. I also want to add that playing c takes d4 first was necessary, as otherwise white could trade his d4 pawn away with d takes c5. But anyway, if white knows what he's doing, he would gambit this pawn away by castling. And my recommendation is to accept this pawn, but when the second pawn is offered with knight c3, don't take it. It's far too risky, as moves like rook e1 followed by knight takes d5 to take advantage of the pin, and even knight b5 will be problematic. So simply go a6 to stop any piece from landing on b5, and the position is good for black. I don't believe white has ample compensation for the sacrificed pawn, and the success of this gambit is largely contingent on black accepting the second pawn. Now another thing about this line to point out is that many players, especially those under 1800 online rating, play bishop d3 without knowing it's a gambit line. And as a result, they go bishop c2 here to reunite the queen with their pawn. but simply knight b4, and the bishop, which is on a fantastic diagonal, will be traded off. Leaving the long diagonal, with moves like bishop b3, will not only severely limit the bishop scope, but we will also have queen to a6 to stop white from castling, since the bishop is some moves away from d3. So that was about bishop d3, and why it's not very common among stronger players. So let's look at the most popular move among masters, bishop e2. It doesn't interfere with the queen's defense of the pawn, and it develops a piece. So we can't play f6 as comfortably as when white neglected his development with a3. So how should black continue? Again, pause the video if you want to. The best move is knight g to e7. And the beauty about this move is that you retain your flexibility to target either d4 or e5. So for example, if white goes d takes c5 here, then knight g6 to attack e5. And of course, we have queen c7 to help out if necessary. Otherwise, we go knight f5 to attack d4. And here I'd like to show you a model game in the French by Alexei Shirov, a 2700 plus rated grandmaster playing black, against Alexander Shabalov, another strong grandmaster. The game continued knight a3, and now and only now did Shirov take on d4. The idea is that now white has committed his knight to a suboptimal square, so black is able to resolve the tension in the center and vacate the c3 square, knowing that white can't make use of that newly vacated square easily. And with the pawn structure clarifying, d4 is confirmed to be the main target, not e5, so black can show his hand and go knight f5 and queen b6. White castled, and so far we have seen very good counter-attacking opportunities in the French, where we can tear down the center with good pawn breaks, c5 and f6. But now I have to share one of the downsides of the opening, and that is this light square bishop. It is a problem piece because we lock it inside the pawn chain as early as move 1 or 2. So it is nearly always going to be the least active piece on the board. If not for this, if we can find a way to liberate this bishop, then we've got ourselves a pretty good position. So bearing this in mind, what do you think Shirov played here? That's right, he moved this knight away, not to b4, he wouldn't want to trade this more central knight for this less central knight, but to a5, intending bishop b5. Shabalov played the aggressive g4 to kick the knight and grab more space, and then went knight e1 so that he could preserve his own light square bishop with knight d3. Then followed h5 to fight back for the f5 square. And right after that, Shirov reactivated his knights to the center to attack d4 once again. And here, despite having more attackers than defenders, black can't actually capture on d4 because it walks into a pin. So for example, if knight takes on d4 and these knights trade off, white can simply go king h1 to prevent this knight from unpinning itself with check. And in the next move, white will go knight c1 to add an attacker to d4, and black will be down a piece. And so, because the siege on d4 wasn't yielding any fruit, Shirov astutely rerouted his queen over to the king's side, queen d8, intending queen h4. And the game eventually ended with a nice king han. Now that king han goes beyond the scope of this opening, so I'll just leave a link to the game in the description if you'd like to check it out. So to summarize, the French defense is centered around treating white's center as a weakness rather than a strength. We can get it with our main pawn break c5 and our secondary pawn break f6. Another key strategy to get at the center is to keep your development flexible, only committing your pieces to their squares when the time is right. So now, concretely speaking, you're well equipped to meet all the main lines in the French. The advanced variation should be familiar territory by now, and if knight d2 or knight c3, we go knight f6, and we either return to our familiar pawn structure immediately, or if bishop g5, we unpin the knight with bishop e7, and it's the same story. As for the exchange variation, we reach a rather harmless and symmetrical position which you can work over the board. Finally, while you can enjoy hacking away at your opponent's center, remember to activate this bad French bishop. And for the remainder of this video, I'd like to briefly show a couple of games and how different players dealt with this problem piece, just to give you some creative direction on how to liberate the bishop. So our first example, we've got f6 to get rid of the e5 pawn, so that you can work the e5 push, and now the bishop's free. Second example, we have f6 again, not to push e5, but to vacate the f7 square so that the bishop can take a long route out, d7 to e8, and finally to h5, or in this game, g6. Last example, which is the quickest way, is to leave the knight on b8 and go b6 and bishop a6. So that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe for subsequent videos to this series where I will cover more nuanced ideas in the French. Take care.